For these pictures taken from August 1944 in French villages and towns captured by Allied troops, France and its then allies should still be ashamed today, because the victors, including then General de Gaulle and the Allied generals, had allowed the mob to take out its rage on those who were least responsible for the deep-seated defeat of 1940, namely on the young women whose only crime had been to fall in love with a German occupation soldier between 1940 and mid-1944. And then they were denounced, the so-called horizontal collaboration. Very interesting collaboration. But when, from August 1944 onwards, French women fell into the arms of Americans or Englishmen, that was all perfectly fine. But now to explain the unbelievable, almost medieval behavior of French men who were supposedly members of this so-called cultured and highly civilized nation, with their motto, liberty, equality, fraternity, especially towards the French women who were friendly with German soldiers. And this happened in the city that is considered the City of Love. To understand it, you have to look back at the German-French history of the past 150 years. Because just as old Prussia, after the death of Frederick the Great in 1786, eventually lived only in the past until it was overtaken by Napoleon I. In 1806, in the Battle of Jena and Auerstedt, it was decisively defeated, and so it was with France. After Napoleon's exile to the island of St. Helena in 1815, it became increasingly sluggish, but not any quieter. The result was a painful defeat for France, which called itself the Grand Nation in the 19th century. The Franco-German War, which took place from July 1870 to May 10, 1871. The war was triggered by the French declaration of war on Prussia, which, according to old custom and tradition, would make it more accurate to name the aggressor first and the attacked second, as is practiced in both English and French, so it would be called the French-German War. But after the French defeat, when parts of the regions of Alsace and Lorraine became the German imperial territory of Alsace-Lorraine, here in 1905, the German-speaking area is shown in blue. A militant desire for revenge, which began in schools, had developed in France and ate deeper and deeper into the French national psyche, like a cancer. For example, in the French National Assembly, seats in the front row were kept empty for the now absent deputies from Alsace-Lorraine. And no speaker missed the chance to theatrically refer to the children who now, quote, have to live under the German yoke. France's Alsace-Lorraine, along with the promise to reincorporate it into France as soon as possible. If that had ever actually been practiced in Germany after 1919 or from 1949 in the Bonn Republic, the front rows in the Reichstag or Bundestag would have remained reserved for the missing representatives from the territories violently separated from the German Reich in all directions. And the chamber would have first commemorated the missing representatives before every session. In any case, after the German defeat in the First World War and on the 28th, June 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was signed almost under duress by the German delegation in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Not only had the German imperial territory of Alsace-Lorraine become French again, but Germany had also been reduced militarily by the treaty to the status of a small middle power. With a 100,000-man army without tanks, airplanes, or warships, which would make one think that France's desire for revenge had been satisfied. Instead, however, what happened after the defeat was the following. The plan for a defensive line up to 25 kilometers wide facing Germany, which had already been considered after the defeat in 1871, was taken up again. This line, which was built starting in 1930, was named the Maginot Line, after the defense minister at the time. And even though, during the 1930s, a significant unwillingness to go to war gradually developed in the Netherlands, Belgium, and also in France, both among the political and military leadership, the Grand Nation continued to rely on its strong army and the heavily fortified Maginot Line, which, in their view, would nip any attack on France from the east in the bud. They were still confident about this, even after Germany, on the 1st of September 1939, had attacked Poland, and as a result, France and Great Britain on the 3rd of September had declared war on Germany, but otherwise had completely refrained from providing any military support to Poland. Especially since, which is often conveniently ignored, on the 17th of the month, the Soviet Union also attacked Poland from the east, and then Hitler and Stalin divided the spoils, which meant that Poland ceased to exist. However, neither Great Britain nor France declared war on the equally aggressive Soviet Union. Instead, especially the British became one of Stalin's main supporters from 1941 onward, revealed a lot and explained many things. But when, on May 10, 1940, the German Wehrmacht began the Western Campaign and, in what German propaganda called a blitzkrieg, defeated the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and finally France within 6 weeks, people everywhere wondered how such a bitter military disaster, especially for France, could have happened. Because, as you can see here in the graphic, France was militarily stronger than Germany in every area, both in 1939 and 1940. On top of that, there were also the armies of Great Britain, Belgium, and the Netherlands. But the fact that the French army was defeated after only 6 weeks was also due to the overall condition of their country. Because the German National Socialist government had managed to find politically ambitious and morally weak people in France as well. There were also National Socialist organizations in Western Europe, which had recruited thousands of collaborators into their service before 1939. These people were in the French Parliament, in the administration, in the police, and in the trade unions. They had significant influence in business associations and in the economy, but all of them considered themselves to be highly honorable people, who supposedly valued nothing more than the well-being of their country. But a good part of the truth was also that they had lost confidence in their own nation and considered a Europe under Hitler to be inevitable. And it was the French aviation industrialists and arms industry bosses who were thinking about joint business ventures with Germany. There were the French parliamentarians who had only reluctantly voted for the war and tried to keep the army out of any risky engagement. There were the food manufacturers who had diverted high-quality canned goods, so that the soldiers in the bunkers of the Maginot Line sometimes found spoiled cans from 1916. And it was the French High Command, like General Maurice Gustave Gamelin, who was mainly responsible for the military fiasco, who sometimes looked at Poland with contempt and was not averse to dividing Europe with Adolf Hitler, or Marshal Philippe Pétain, who was highly revered as a hero of the First World War, who, after the defeat, served for 4 years as head of state of the État français, that is, the French state, later known as the Vichy regime, and worked closely with Germany. Or the socialist Pierre Lavalier, who was Prime Minister of France twice before the defeat. Finally, Admiral François Darlan, who headed the Foreign, Interior, and War Ministries in Vichy. But why am I mentioning these bigwigs? After all, this is about the young women who, during the 4 years of German occupation, fell in love with a German soldier, and maybe even had a child with him. Across Europe, estimates of the so-called children fathered by German Wehrmacht soldiers between 1939 and 1945 range from 1 to 2 million, while the number of children fathered by Wehrmacht soldiers and children of German prisoners of war in France from 1941 to 1949 is estimated to be up to 200,000. For decades, they were denigrated as enfants maudits, damned children, or bâtards de Boche, bastards of a Boche. Their mothers, as I mentioned at the beginning, were accused of so-called horizontal collaboration and called German whores. Sometimes raped, often publicly humiliated, their heads shaved bald and driven through the streets under the jeers of the mob. And if they had small children, they were ostracized for many years as German bastards and were treated in the worst possible way. That also served as a distraction from the collaboration with the German occupation that had taken place millions of times in all areas of life and all social classes in the years before. Until the turnaround, when opportunists overnight turned from Pétainists to Gaullists and claimed they had always been against it. In the months that followed, up to 450 women are said to have been lynched, for which, of course, there are no photographs. It all started after the invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944. When the Allies approached Paris 2 months later, members of the mostly communist resistance on the 19th August, in the capital that was hardly defended on the orders of the German city commander, General of the Infantry Dietrich von Koltitz, started an uprising. Barely a week later, on August 25th, American and so-called Free French troops marched into Paris. Von Koltitz had surrendered. A day later, General de Gaulle led a parade down the Champs-Élysées and formed a new government. What followed was a campaign of revenge, in which around 10,000 Parisians who had collaborated with the German occupation in some way became victims. 8,000 were convicted, and 116 were executed. In total, after the expulsion of the German occupation, about 6,000 men and women are said to have been killed in France without a trial. In addition, the French historian Marc Berger wrote that it was not primarily about sexual contacts with Germans, but that it was enough to have worked as an office clerk, domestic helper, cook, laundress, or in the hotel and restaurant industry or health services, to fall under suspicion of Germanization. As for the women who had already been humiliated by having their heads shaved, they were often driven through the streets on the back of a truck, partly tarred, half naked, and smeared with swastikas made of paint or lipstick. Churchill's private secretary, Jack Colville, described such a scene in Bayeux, but later put it into perspective. Accompanied by boos and insults from the French population, I saw an open truck drive by, with a dozen miserable-looking women sitting in the back, their hair completely shaved off. They were crying and hung their heads in shame. Even though I was repulsed by this cruelty, it crossed my mind that we Britons had not experienced an invasion or occupation for about 900 years, so we were not in a position to judge. The American historian Forrest Polk, who served as a sergeant and officially appointed war correspondent under the chief war correspondent Samuel Marshall, described the look of the victims in the hands of their tormentors as that of a hunted animal. And Colonel Harry Dillon McHugh, commander of the 318th U.S. Infantry Regiment of the 80th Infantry Division, deployed near Argentine in Normandy, reported, "The French rounded up collaborators, cut their hair off, and burned it in huge piles, the smell of which could be detected for miles. In addition, women who collaborated had to run a gauntlet and were actually beaten." Finally, the American war photographer Lee Miller described her observations. "I saw 4 young women being led down the street and hurried over to take a photo. Suddenly, I found myself at the front of the procession. The locals mistook me for the soldier who had captured them, or something like that, and I was kissed and congratulated, while the unfortunate women were slapped and spat on." Now, you might think that with the German surrender in May 1945, this inhuman behavior would have ended, but the exact opposite was true. Now these actions were carried out even in front of children, and as is consistently reported, the mob raged even more violently from May to July 1945 without any intervention from the authorities. But anyone who now thinks that primitive revenge taken on young women was limited to France is mistaken. Wherever the Wehrmacht had appeared as an occupying force, it was always the same group of people who, after the Wehrmacht was driven out by the Allies, now posed as avengers, to cover up their own behavior over 4 years of compliance. And if you believe Wikipedia, after the war there were even unbelievable attempts in Norway to sell the 8,000 children registered by German authorities who had German fathers as potential labor slaves to Australia. So far, all that is known about how the Soviet Union dealt with the local partners of Germans and their children is that an unknown number of them were sent to Siberia or shot on the spot. If you want to learn more about this topic, here are 3 books on it. 2 by Ebba D. Drolshagen, Wehrmacht Children in Search of the Father They Never Knew, and Not Getting Away Unscathed, The Fate of Women in the Occupied Countries Who Loved Wehrmacht Soldiers, as well as by Jean-Paul Picapet and Ludwig Nortz, The Children of Shame.